Hello, and welcome to this month's edition of My Life in Art, your regular arts program here on the Prescott Community Access Channel. We are sponsored by the Prescott Area Arts and Humanities Council, your oldest local arts advocacy organization. We regularly represent the arts in front of the city of Prescott and the surrounding areas. Today, our guest is Cathy Cowen. We are happy to have her here. Cathy is a well-known local artist and painter, and she is going to tell us about some of her work. Welcome, Cathy.
Thank you, Parker. It's a pleasure to be here.
To begin with, give us a little bit of your background and how you came to start painting.
Well, I know the program is called My Life in Art, but I started very late in my life in art. As a matter of fact, early on I thought I would be an artist, but I became a single parent and decided that art was too risky. I needed something that would bring me a paycheck. And so I put it off until I retired. So about 15 years ago when I retired and I moved to Prescott, within a month I started taking classes at Yavapai College, and I haven't stopped since. And that's how I began my life in art.
Wonderful. Now, most of your art, you do various types of paintings. What sort of subjects do you like to paint?
Well, I have to tell you that I really have only been painting for 2 years. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, I know you think that I was a painter because I painted a portrait of you, but I had only been painting a few months when I did that portrait. I actually started my life in art as a ceramic sculptor.
Wonderful.
And the first thing I did was I took a ceramics course at Yavapai College and fell in love with the medium. Fell in love with clay and became pretty obsessed with clay. And that's what I did for 12 years, almost every day.
Do you still do ceramics at all?
Yeah, about 2 years ago I decided to move on. Clay is a very heavy and unpredictable medium. I mean, you never know what is going to come out of the kiln, what color it's going to be, whether it's going to be cracked, what size. I mean, and plus it's a very heavy medium. I mean, you're carrying around 25 bags of dead weight of clay. It's cold, it's wet, it's winter in Prescott. So I decided 2 years ago to go to a lighter medium and switch it up entirely and start painting. So really, most of my life in art has been in the clay medium.
Do you have most of your clay sculptures left?
Well, I was able to sell a number of them, and that always makes me happy. I had quite a few around, and then I decided one day that there was so much sculpture in my house that I thought if I brought in one more heavy sculpture, the floor might collapse into the basement. I mean, I had so much. And I'd given a lot away, and I took pictures of the work, and then I established the Cathy Cowen sculpture garden out in the Prescott National Forest. So I have littered the forest with some of my work, let's put it that way.
What sort of things did you sculpt?
I started with just being totally fascinated with clay itself and the medium and all the things you can do with it. Coil it, squeeze it, print it, form it, roll it, sculpt it, scratch it. I mean, there's so much you can do with clay. And I started out by making clay pieces. I liquefied the clay, and then I would dip fabric into the clay.
Wow.
And then wrap it into different shapes and so forth, bottles, bowls, masks. And when it fires, it would fire out, and it would be almost translucent and transparent, but also very fragile, which is never a good thing when you're trying to transport a piece to a gallery. And I can't tell you how many times, Parker, I either didn't make it to the gallery with the piece, or when I went into the gallery, the piece was in shards. So I switched from doing that the work that I really loved in this very fragile work to, I made a lot of masks, and I went to solid clay. And then I became fascinated with the human form, and I started to make a lot of torsos. So I had made torsos of friends of mine. You know, I would do a plaster cast of their bodies, and then after that hardened, I could put clay in it, and I would have a mold. And then I did various things to those molds to embellish them. One, for instance, has a poem written on it by the woman whose torso it is. One of them is covered with litter that you might find in the national forest on the ground.
Oh, wow.
Leaves and twigs and mushrooms and all kinds of plant life. And so that I did for quite a while. And I did quite a few of those torsos. And many of them represented different things that I like in nature. For instance, one is called All Washed Up, and it is a torso of a woman, and it's all the things you might find around if you found this torso laying on the sand on the beach with all the flotsam and jetsam, driftwood and different things, bottle caps and stuff that you might find, seaweed at the beach.
And your various ceramic sculptures, how many, how did they go over in galleries?
I, as I mentioned, I did not have a very good experience with most galleries, and many of my friends will have horror stories, and I wasn't too excited about being a gallery, and so I went more with competitions. I started to enter competitions, and for instance, the Jewish Community Center in Tucson has a very large sculpture garden, beautiful. And I entered and was chosen, and one of my works was installed there for 18 months. And it was a piece, it was when I was very much again into the human figure, the face, the body. And I made a mold of a face, a friend of mine's, and then I reproduced that mold in a very thin mask, life mask, 30 times.
Wow.
And then it was installed in the ground. And the faces seemed to be coming up out of the earth. And it's called Truth Will Out. And this having been the Jewish Community Center with the whole idea of the Holocaust, this was a piece that really spoke to many of their patrons.
Wow. But ultimately you gave that up and you began painting.
I did, just 2 years ago, as a matter of fact. And as I mentioned, basically because it was sort of an inspiration, and I was kind of wanted to put clay aside. So I did, and I started, and the first thing I did was, again, I enrolled in a course at the college. And I started painting, and I decided I take pictures with my cell phone. And then I decided to do a series. I did a series of 9 portraits, one of which is a portrait of you, I might add, of men that I have met and know around Prescott, including my own son and other people that you might know. Jonathan Best, he's a musician, and other people who are Walt. You must know Walt Mendelsohn. He's an actor in town. Maybe you don't know him, but anyway, these are friends and people who I know, and so I started to do portraits, and I did 9 portraits, and then, as you know, there was a show at the Raven of those portraits.
Yes.
So that was my very first painting effort.
Wow.
I've never painted before.
I know I've seen some other paintings of yours. Tell us a little more about some of those. What inspires you?
Well, often it's music that inspires me. I come from a very musical family, and so I often go to concerts around town, and I've been taking photographs, again, with my cell phone of artists. I don't know if you know Ping Brothers, Drew Hall.
Yes.
Of course, my grandsons, Kazi and True Borman. My daughter-in-law who plays the accordion. So I take pictures and then I paint from those photographs. And I'm doing a series right now of local musicians.
Oh, wonderful.
And I'm doing 9. And I've got 7 finished, and I've got 2 more to go.
Okay.
So
you have had your paintings. You've painted other things than portraits, I believe. I know I've seen one of your paintings in the Prescott Center for the Arts Gallery.
Oh, that's true. That's true, because the Prescott Center for the Arts has calls for different shows, and the shows have a theme. And that show that you're thinking of happened to be Cinco de Mayo, or...
It was that Day of the Dead.
Day of the Dead, that's what it was. Day of the Dead. Thank you for that. And I had done a skull, and it's a skull, and in his teeth I put a little tattoo on the teeth of another skull.
And it sold.
Immediately, people liked that. I mean, I should have made prints, I guess.
Probably so. Many painters do. You were talking to me just before we went on about being an experience you had being artist in residence at the Hubble Trading Post National Historic Site. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, in 2011, I applied to be the artist in residence at the Hubble Trading Post, which is located in Ganado, Arizona, on the Navajo Reservation, or the Diné, as they like to be called. And I was awarded this residency. And so that trading post, I don't know if you've ever been there, but there is an active working trading post there. And they also have the Hubble home is there. And it's just full of wonderful art because Mr. Hubble, Lorenzo Hubble, had many, many rooms in his home and he entertained artists there. And as payment for their room and board, they would leave art. And so his collection of Western art is superb.
Wow.
And the house is full also of beautiful Navajo carvings, basketry, and of course, rugs. And Dorothy Hubble, one of his daughters, eventually built a guest hogan on the property. And it's a beautiful little hogan. And so they started to have, after the family sold the property to the National Park Service in the, I think it was 1963, I'm going to say, they started this artist in residence. And you get to live in this beautiful, beautiful hogan. And so when the site closes up at 6 o'clock every night, you are the only person there. And it is
Wow.
magical.
I bet it is.
It is truly magical. So your job as the artist in residence is, of course, to set up and make art. And Dorothy had in the back, next to the little guest house, is this enormous slab of red granite. And it's set up as a table. And so you can work on this. It must be 12 feet long and 3 feet thick and about 5 feet wide. It's enormous. And so I set up on that table and I would sculpt. And of course, visitors to the trading post were allowed to come over and talk and ask questions. And it was a very memorable experience. And as a result of that, some of my work is now in the Hubble house because there's an atrium, an outdoor atrium in the inner part of the house where you walked from the main house to the dining room. And there was an artist there named Edward Sawyer in the late 1800s, and he produced a number of plaques that he carved out of clay of various Navajo people. And those plaques were placed in this atrium, and over the years, the stucco came off, the plaques fell down, and they cracked. And the curator at Hubble asked me if I could reproduce those because they had the original molds. And so I made molds from the original molds, and then I reproduced them, and now my plaques, my reproductions, are now installed in the Hubble House.
Wow.
So I'm very proud of that.
Absolutely.
It was a really wonderful experience.
Okay. We shall return in just a moment with My Life in Art and our guest, Cathy Cowen. Welcome back to My Life in Art. I'm your host, Parker Anderson, and we are talking with Cathy Cowen, prominent local painter and sculptor. And Cathy, before the break, we were talking about your term as artist in residence up at the Hubble Trading Post National Historic Site. How long were you there?
Each internship is only 3 weeks. I wish it had been longer, but as it turned out, I went up there quite a few times after that because they asked me to do another project at Hubble, and that was remodel the kitchen in the guest hogan because it was falling apart, quite frankly. And I made tiles, and for the back surround in the kitchen, you know, the part that goes behind on the wall. And the curator there, Ed Chamberlain, took me into the archives. And you just could not believe, Parker, what I saw in these archives. And there were large cabinets and with big drawers, and he pulled out these drawers, and in these drawers would be concho belts that, you know, 10 handmade concho belts that were made out of old silver dollars originally.
Wow.
I mean, the silver was magnificent. And each concho belt, there were drawers and drawers of them. They don't have display space for all this. Each one was different. But the thing that really fascinated me was the belt buckles themselves. So I took pictures of belt buckles, and then I recreated them in clay on tiles and made molds. And so all the tiles are of these concho belt buckles all over the kitchen. Yeah, so it's something I'm very proud of what my work that I did at Hubble, and of the people that I met there and the friends that I've made who will be lifelong friends.
Wonderful. Now, the Artist in Residence program, is that sponsored by the National Park Service or the Navajo tribe?
It's actually sponsored by the National Park Service, and for viewers who might be interested, almost every county, state, and national park has an artist in residence. So if you're interested in spending some time in a fascinating place and learning about it, I highly recommend going online and applying, although it takes some time, like most government programs,
Yes.
and you have to be patient. You usually have to apply at least a year in advance. But, you know, I can remember the first time I went to Grand Canyon and went to an artist talk there. That was the artist in residence. He or she is living at the canyon, and they're required to put on some shows for the public about art and their art.
Sure. Okay. And now, you're not the, as you mentioned in the first half of our program, you're not the only artist per se in your family. You have musicians, performers. Tell us a little more about your family, Cathy.
Oh, I'd be happy to. I'm very proud of my family. First of all, let me start with my parents, who, although they didn't make their living as artists, always were making art. My mother was a quilter. My father was a carver and did a lot of drawings. And then, of course, my son, who has a degree in art from the University of Wisconsin, and he is a painter for the most part, although he dabbled in clay. He didn't catch the clay fever the way I did. And my daughter-in-law is a pretty well-known local musician, Meg Borman. She plays the accordion around town, and also on the Grand Canyon Railway. She's an entertainer on the railroad. My grandsons are in a band, Cosimo and True Borman, and my granddaughter Opal, who's also been in the theater, as you know, she's also a musician and had won a scholarship, one of the Acker scholarships, when she was 11 years old for playing Flight of the Bumblebee on her marimba. And now she's taking up painting. She's taking watercolor painting lessons.
Wonderful.
So everybody's a ham in my family, one way or another.
What sculpture or painting that you've done, shall we say, has attracted the most attention, brought you the most comment, or evoked the biggest reaction from people? Do you have any?
Yes, there is one that comes to mind. I call it Me, Myself, and I, and again, it was a mask, a plaster of Paris mask of my own face, you know, with no hair, no nothing. And it's kind of a side view. It's a profile. And so I made that mask, and I reproduced it over and over, and I reproduced it in a medium called paper clay, which is dissolved paper in clay, and it's the liquid form, and you pour it into the mold, and it's very thin. It's about as thick as a potato chip. So again, it's very fragile. But I made a series of these, and then they're in a line across the wall, and because of the lighting, the shadows fall on these faces, and it's the one that got the most attention. And as a matter of fact, the Shemer Art Museum in Phoenix actually featured me as an artist and put me on their front page of their brochure when I was in their show.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
What other shows have you had entries in outside of the Prescott area? Have there been others?
Yes, there have. One that comes to mind is at the Herberger Theater. They have their own art gallery in the rotunda of the theater. And I entered a show there. At the time, I was working in an entirely different medium, still involved in torsos, but what I was doing was I was making paper mache torsos, and then I was taking feathers, and I would screw a hole, tiny little hole in these torsos, these paper mache, and then glue a feather in. and I made a series of these beautiful feathered torsos. I think they're pretty magnificent pieces myself. I mean, they're
Wonderful.
beautiful, but they're very hard to make. Imagine drilling thousands of tiny little holes in what is essentially wood. And I made about 9 of those. Again, that seems to be my favorite number. And that one of my pieces actually was in the Herberger show, and also took first place at Yavapai College in their student show.
Wonderful.
So they're very beautiful pieces.
Right. And since your family is artistically inclined, they've been very supportive of your endeavors, I trust.
Well, I know that if one of my pieces is going to be in a show, we can fill the gallery with just my family, and often do. So I'm lucky that way, yes. Very supportive family.
Do you have any advice you would give to anybody who might be interested in trying to start sculpting or painting? What would you say to some young person who's developing that interest and isn't sure whether to follow it?
Well, that's a tough one because I myself had an interest and decided not to follow it when I was very young because I had a very thin skin. You know, I couldn't take criticism, even if it was constructive criticism. So what I would say to a young person today is accept the criticism for what it is. It's usually constructive criticism, and follow your heart. No matter what anyone else says about your art, it's really got to be what comes from inside you. Yes, a teacher can teach you the technique, how to make clay stick together and how to spray on a glaze or whatever, but really the idea, the inspiration, and the work has to be done by you, and you have to just go with it. Some of it you're going to want to toss, and some of it you're going to fall in love with. And so, you know, kind of like believe in yourself.
Yes. So, Cathy, what is on the horizon for you? I'm sure you've got some ideas for new paintings floating around in your head or things you'd want to pursue in that field, don't you?
Well, I do. My next series of portraits, because I love doing portraits, will probably involve working women. I've already started to photograph some women. As a matter of fact, the woman who delivered gravel to my driveway and was driving a dump truck for one of the local companies in town, I took some photos of her doing the work. And so that'll be my next series. But in the meantime, I've started on another medium. I don't know if you noticed, but I made my earrings. They're enamel.
Oh, wow.
And I've started to work in enamel now, which is another medium I really like. So I'm doing not jewelry so much, I'm doing more art pieces.
So these are enamel earrings you're wearing.
Yes, they are.
Wonderful, wonderful. Do you have any thought of doing bigger pieces with enamel? Or?
As a matter of fact, I am, but the copper's kind of expensive.
Yes, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
And yes, I do not want to stay. These are more or less, when you're working small like this, you can afford to make mistakes and test out different techniques. And once I go to larger pieces, I want to have that kind of experience under my belt.
Wonderful. Well, Cathy, it has been a pleasure having you this month on My Life in Art. Thank you. And
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for showing up to watch us. I'm Parker Anderson, your host, on behalf of the Prescott Area Arts and Humanities Council, your local oldest arts advocacy organization in Prescott, and you can find us on the web. Thank you. Until next month, have a good one.